So Daniel Ricciardo in 2022 at McLaren, but overall for his McLaren career has had a pretty tough time. Hasn't quite performed as well as we know he can. Yes, he's had a couple great results here or there, obviously the win at the 2021 Italian Grand Prix. But it looks as though McLaren are not going to tolerate anymore these poor or poorer performances from Ricciardo than we have seen in the past. And what we're going to look at in this video is Ricciardo being unfairly treated by McLaren? And in my view, no, he is not. And we'll get into that as this video goes on. But let's first start with how we got here. So in 2020, Daniel Ricciardo, before the 2020 season actually started, because Carlos Sainz went to Ferrari, obviously McLaren needed a driver, so they hired Daniel Ricciardo. Now, at the time, and I still believe it was the right move to make because McLaren have been better than Renault/Alpine since 2020, but Ricciardo in 2020 had arguably his best year in Formula One. Finished, fifth, I think, in the championship in 2020 in a Renault car that ended up finishing fifth in the Constructors' Championship. It was a good car, the Renault, that year, but it wasn't as good as people may think. It definitely wasn't as good as the Racing Point car. And also, I say the McLaren car was a tad better than the Renault in 2020. It was a very impressive season from Ricciardo, and in regards to his move to McLaren, it was definitely, obviously, a deserving move, but it was an exciting move, not just for McLaren, but also Ricciardo as well, because it appeared Ricciardo was performing at a very high level and quite possibly was at his peak of his career. And let's look just to see how great that 2020 season was. So yeah, finished fifth in the World Drivers' Championship and had 8 top 6 finishes out of 17 races that year. Finished in the points 14 times out of the 17 races and had 2 podium finishes. The first one was at the Nürburgring and the second one at Imola. He was very, very good that year. And really, the only reason Renault were competitive with Racing Point and McLaren in the constructors' fight that year for third was because of Daniel Ricciardo. Esteban Ocon would improve later in the season, but was nowhere near Ricciardo in 2020. Ricciardo was absolutely fantastic. And going into 2021, Ricciardo was of very high value. And you need to remember that I said that because it does relate to what I'm going to say later. That, again, he was of very high value going into 2021 for the McLaren team, and of a lot higher value than he is now. So let's get into his 2021 season, which, yes, saw him win the Italian Grand Prix at Monza. Was a fantastic win for Daniel. Was a fantastic weekend where he out-qualified Lando Norris, finished in the top 3 in the sprint race, and then pretty much led the race from lights out to the checkered flag. But other than that, he was consistently behind his teammate Lando Norris in 2021 and just couldn't really compete with Norris and just wasn't as good as the Brit, who had a very good season in the McLaren. McLaren obviously missed out on third in the championship because Ferrari, just about with an improvement to their power unit, beat him to it. And to be honest, because of Ricciardo's season that was still good, but not anywhere near as good as it really should have been, Ricciardo's lack of performances, or good performances, and lack of pace at times did hurt McLaren's chances quite a bit of finishing third in the championship. And I think it was the reason why McLaren did not finish third in the championship. Again, I'll cut back away from this clip because this is the wrong one. But yeah, this win in Monza, again, was a great performance, but we didn't see this enough from Ricciardo, where he was consistently at one with the car and was at least equal or around where Lando Norris was in terms of pace. We just didn't see that enough from Daniel Ricciardo. And let's get into some stats regarding Ricciardo versus Norris to really look at just where Norris was better than Daniel Ricciardo. So In the races and qualifying, Norris beat him 15-7, was quite clearly better in both qualifying and the race, was consistently quite clearly behind. Did, though, only finish 45 points behind, which did show to me that when Ricciardo did have a better weekend and was closer to Norris, that he was able to score quite a lot of points. Obviously, the win in Monza, but obviously finishing 4th at Spa, after qualifying 4th, obviously, on that very wet weekend. Also had a 5th place, I think, at the British Grand Prix. So when Ricciardo actually got properly close to Norris, he did have some very good results, but could not consistently pull it off, and they were equal when it came to DNFs. But the most important stat was that the average gap from Norris to Ricciardo in qualifying in 2021 was 0.757 of a second. That is way too big. If you're going to be, and this is not just for Ricciardo, this is for every F1 driver, if you are going to be slower than your teammate in qualifying, fine. But you can be really no more than a third of a second slower than your teammate. If you're 4 to 5 tenths off, or even worse, I'm sorry, but that is simply not good enough. And to be on average, when Norris out-qualified Ricciardo 3/4 of a second slower, is not good enough. And he had to improve on that in 2022. And my hope, and a lot of people's hope, was that Ricciardo would improve in just all areas and would be consistently better than he was in 2021. But what I want to get into now is some quotes from Ricciardo, I think, at the end of that season or the beginning of the next season, where he got into a bit more so the reasons why he was not competitive, or as competitive in 2021 as really he should have been. So here's what he had to say. One was, before I actually get into the quote, I want to explain what these quotes are about. It's him talking about, or answering a question about, why were you a lot worse performing in 2021 than we expected? And this is what he had to say. One was the challenges I faced with the car, and obviously trying to gel with that. And yeah, I think that definitely did play a role in 2021. In fact, I think, looking back, I think he was always going to struggle with the car because the regulations were pretty much the same, except for the floor area, going into 2021 from 2020. So the car was always going to be built, probably not built, but was always going to suit Lando Norris more because he had the experience of being in the McLaren car. But, we hoped for 2022 that would improve. But then he said the second reason was being away from home, as he said. And then I think the other one was being away from home. Just not having some of those home comforts or family surroundings you're kind of just used to. I think sometimes if you live at home, you don't really notice it because it is always in front of you. But obviously, when I left Australia and moved away from family, you certainly notice it more. Now, what he's saying here is in regards to COVID, obviously, where a lot of people couldn't go back to Australia because Australia completely shut themselves off from the rest of the world. And have only, I think, a few months ago, have opened themselves back up to the rest of the world in terms of allowing Australian citizens back in to Australia. Now, definitely, there is no doubt about it. Not just for him, but for others, that's been a big problem mentally for Australians to, not be able to be at home and to be so far away from home for such a long time because of COVID. And I do feel for Daniel Ricciardo here, but the reason I wouldn't say I don't buy it as an excuse. The reason I don't think he can, or we can use it as a big excuse as to why Ricciardo's not been good enough, as I'll get onto with his 2022 performances as well, is because he wasn't the only one necessarily who had to, to shut away from family and from anyone from the outside during that time in 2020, 2021 as well, and even maybe 2022 as well. Because we know that when the F1 season started again in 2020, they had, the COVID bubble and basically driver access to the outside world for a lot of 2020, or pretty much all of 2020, but also 2021, a lot of 2021 was restricted, and they couldn't be really, with their loved ones a lot, which is a shame. But others suffered with this. I think Sergio Perez was another one who couldn't really go back home as much as he wanted to during that time, but he still performed at a very high level during the time. And even for drivers at the time who were, not living that far away from their, team bases and where they needed to be, it still affected them as well. So I'm not going to pretend like this isn't an issue. It definitely is an issue, and it would have affected him, not having that, boost and mental, that positive mental health of seeing your family and all of that. That would have definitely affected him, but let's not pretend like he was the only one suffering from this. Yes, he was probably suffering from it more so than others. I think that's definitely true to say, but it wasn't like he was the only one suffering with this. So it's an excuse to a certain extent, yes, as to why his performances in 2021, certainly in the first half of the season, were not quite up to where they should be. But a lot of people, not just in F1, but the sporting world, had to deal with this as well. But going into 2022, because obviously, COVID was less of a threat because of the vaccine, and obviously that means you can travel around more. That would have helped Ricciardo going back and seeing his family in Australia. But also, with, Ricciardo now at McLaren, having had a year going into 2022, the hope would have been for Ricciardo, and the hope was, for me, that he would gel a lot more with the car and would get on a lot better with the car and would have consistently better performances. But if we move on to 2022 quickly, here we go. It just wasn't that great for Ricciardo, as we have seen, and as I'll get onto in a moment with some stats. It just wasn't quite at the level where Ricciardo needed to be at, as I'll get onto with these stats now with Lando Norris. Now, actually, if I go back to the stats regarding these two in 2021, you can see, quite clearly in qualifying in the race, Norris is ahead, but it's by, 75%, say, in qualifying in the race over the course of the season. So far for 2022, it's pretty much the same percentage-wise in Norris's favour, but then in qualifying, Ricciardo has taken kind of another step backwards in a way, because he has been pretty much hammered by Lando Norris this season. The only two races, by the way, he's out-qualified Lando Norris were the race in Spain where Lando had tonsillitis and still beat him in the race, and then in Canada where Lando had a problem, a technical issue in Q2, which meant he couldn't go through to Q3, and Ricciardo did. Those are the only two races where he's out-qualified him. So if Lando had not suffered those things, you could potentially be looking at Lando being 13-0 over Ricciardo in qualifying, which is simply not good enough compared to Norris. For, it doesn't matter that it's Daniel Ricciardo. If it was any driver, it would not be good enough. You can see with the points there, Lando Norris on 76, Daniel Ricciardo only on 19 points, and Norris, having one DNF, Ricciardo having 0. Lando's DNF was in Miami, I'm pretty sure, where he was, I think, running in the points, or maybe might have grabbed a point or so from that Grand Prix. But yeah, it's been, at best, just as poor compared to Norris as 2021 was. But to be honest, it's been even worse. And you can see there the key stat that if we look back to 2021, the average gap from Norris to Ricciardo in qualifying in 2021 was 0.757 of a second. So you would expect that to come down by a couple tenths of a second, but it didn't really come down at all. The average gap from Norris to Ricciardo in qualifying so far this year in 2022 is 0.718 of a second. So he's improved, but it's still, he's not really improved that much, to be honest. So he hasn't really made a step forward in 2022. Now, this 2022 car, I will say, it isn't as good as the 2021 car, and I think the reason McLaren are not fourth in the championship right now and behind Alpine, I don't think that's necessarily because of Daniel Ricciardo. I think it's mostly due to the McLaren car not being good enough and McLaren under-delivering massively on their car for this season, but it just isn't good enough from Ricciardo. It just isn't good enough. I can accept drivers having the odd poor season, like I have covered previously with Carlos Sainz, where Carlos in 2018 against Nico Hülkenberg at Renault had an off year. I can accept an off year for any driver, but 2 years like this in a row is just simply not good enough. And Ricciardo, and I've seen, plenty of people online claiming that, he's been unfairly treated and that McLaren should have treated him better and that the knife has been stuck in the back. Daniel Ricciardo has not been unfairly treated by McLaren. That is absolutely not the case. Like I said earlier, when I was talking about when he moved from Renault to McLaren, the driver they signed was of very high value. Not the highest value on the grid, obviously, but he was of very high value. They were signing someone who was a proven race winner and was one of the best 4 or 5 drivers on the grid at the time of when they, signed him to their team. But he has not performed to that level. Not just has he not performed to that level, he's not been anywhere close to that level. And, once again, just hasn't got on with the car and just hasn't been anywhere near as good as Lando Norris. Now, maybe Lando Norris, no matter how good Daniel Ricciardo performs, is always going to be better than Daniel Ricciardo. I think that's absolutely fine. I don't think Ricciardo being behind or worse than Norris is a bad thing, but it's how far behind he is. That is not what McLaren signed him for, because when McLaren had Carlos Sainz and Lando Norris, they had 2 very competitive drivers constantly in the points and, really pushing things for the team. That's what they wanted to keep up. Obviously, Sainz left them and joined joined the Ferrari team. So they wanted to keep that up by hiring Daniel Ricciardo, another very competitive driver. But Ricciardo has not kept that up. He's not been able to compete with Lando Norris regularly in the top 5, top 6, top 7 of races, which would have helped McLaren last season, finished 3rd in the championship. And even though the McLaren car this season is a lot worse than it was last season, it would have helped them this season as well, probably being 4th in the Constructors' Championship. So McLaren haven't done anything wrong, in my view. They signed a driver who was a very high value at the time, and he simply hasn't delivered. It is the same, pretty much, as a football club buying a player that's, performing at a very high level, and then suddenly, when he joins that club, performing a lot worse than expected. It's the same, essentially. He just hasn't performed as well as the club, team, whatever you want to call them, franchise, expected and wanted. And that is why McLaren, it appears, are wanting to replace him. And the only person Daniel Ricciardo can blame for his time at McLaren not going well is himself, I'm afraid. He just hasn't delivered. Hasn't been quick enough in qualifying. Hasn't been consistently good in the races, really. Which I was very surprised by, I have to say, in 2021 and so far this year, because that was a trait of his before he came to McLaren, that he was, consistently on race day, always performing at a very high level. Just hasn't been the case in 2021 or 2022 on a consistent basis. And like I said, the only person he can blame is himself. You cannot be 0.7 of a second slower than your teammate and get away with that on a, 7/10 of a second slower than your teammate on a consistent basis over the course of 2 years, pretty much. You cannot perform at that level and expect to go upwards or be the top 3-4 teams on the grid. You just cannot expect that to happen, I'm afraid. But it does appear that Ricciardo's time at McLaren, it might be over, but it might also not be over. Because obviously we've heard a lot of rumours because of the whole Alpine situation. With Oscar Piastri being announced for Alpine to replace Fernando Alonso, he's going to Aston Martin. Then Piastri rejecting that and saying no, he's not racing for Alpine next year. The rumour is that Piastri is going to McLaren, replacing Daniel Ricciardo. You would assume, I think a lot of us assumed at the time that Ricciardo was going to be replaced, but Ricciardo is under contract at McLaren, I think until the end of 2023, the end of next year. So, apparently, Ricciardo has told McLaren that he is seeking, as you can see down the top left, a $21 million payout for McLaren to terminate his contract. Now, that we have seen before, because at Ferrari, at the end of 2009, when Fernando Alonso was announced to be joining Ferrari from Renault to partner Felipe Massa, Ferrari had to buy out Kimi Raikkonen's contract because Kimi was actually contracted to race for the Ferrari team for 2010. What they instead did was they bought out his contract to get Fernando in the team with Felipe Massa as his teammate. And I think it was $15 million at the time that they paid Kimi Raikkonen not to race for them in 2010. So we have seen this situation before. The thing is, though, given with the budget caps we've got at the moment in F1, and money being a harder thing to come by these days because of inflation and all of that, it's going to be interesting to see whether McLaren can actually come up with the $21 million, because that is quite a bit of money, even for a team like McLaren. So he might leave McLaren at the end of this season, but he also might not, because if they can't come up with that money, then he legally is entitled to stay at McLaren, I'm pretty sure. They could come to a mutual termination of his contract, but by the sounds of it, Daniel Ricciardo does not want his contract at McLaren to end. So we'll see what happens with Ricciardo in regards to will he stay at the McLaren team. But the point I want to make is, if he doesn't stay at McLaren and McLaren do get rid of him, do not blame anyone else other than Daniel Ricciardo, because McLaren, the cars they've given him, maybe haven't been all the time as good as it really should have been or could have been, but he has had his chances now and just hasn't simply been good enough. And again, the value that they signed him for has dropped quite significantly since then. But what will Daniel Ricciardo's future look like? Will he stay at McLaren for next year? And when he does eventually leave McLaren, let's say he does race for the McLaren team next year, and then Oscar Piastri races for McLaren instead in 2024 instead of 2023. Where does Ricciardo go from here after this very tricky, very tricky time that he's had at McLaren? By the way, I just want to clarify, when I said I'm not sure how McLaren are going to come up with the funds to pay off Daniel Ricciardo, I do know that the driver salary is not a part of the cap, but they still have to find $21 million, which, once they've allocated all the money they can to different areas of the team, they might not have enough to actually fund Ricciardo, being paid off to leave team. So just want to clarify that quickly. But in regards to Ricciardo, where could he go for the 2023 season, or just the future in general, where his next move hopefully will be to another F1 team? rather than going off the grid. I don't think Daniel Ricciardo has performed bad enough at all to be off the grid. He definitely deserves to be in Formula One. There is no doubt about that. My hope is that, let's say Ricciardo is not at McLaren next year. My hope is that he'll go to Alpine, because it would be a good move for Daniel, because Alpine are pretty much as quick as the McLaren team. And obviously with this man, Oscar Piastri, not joining the Alpine team, it seems, for 2023. Obviously there's going to be a legal battle, so maybe that will change. And Fernando Alonso leaving Alpine in the dust by moving on to Aston Martin for next year. It puts Alpine in a situation where they desperately need a very good driver to match alongside Esteban Ocon. So my hope is that Daniel Ricciardo, if he is leaving McLaren at the end of this year, which is most probable, I would say, at this point, unless something drastically changes, which it could, I think Ricciardo, will likely go to Alpine for next year. If he does, though, stay at McLaren for 2023, that would probably be the better option for him. And the reason I say that is because if you look at the grid for next year, there's not really that many availabilities going about. Because, McLaren, not McLaren, Mercedes, Red Bull, Ferrari, their driver lineups are sorted for next season. Aston Martin's is now Alonso and Stroll. And then, you've got Haas F1, who are not absolutely confirmed yet, but I think it will be Schumacher and Magnussen. Probably at Haas F1. Alfa Romeo, I think, are going to be the same. So pretty much the grid next season is the same. But for 2024, because certain driver contracts are coming to an end at the end of 2023, I think Ricciardo has a better chance of a good move, or maybe a better move from McLaren than he would have at the end of this year. Because really, if he was to leave McLaren at the end of this year, the only move he could make is really to go to Alpine. Maybe there's an opening at Haas F1, but realistically, the only move he can make is to go to the Alpine team. When if he left McLaren at the end of 2023, then he could go to Alpine. He could go to Aston Martin if Alonso decides after a year, screw it, I don't want to stay at this team. He could go to, you never know, a Mercedes if Lewis Hamilton suddenly decides to retire at the end of next year. Remember, Hamilton's contract does end at the end of 2023. So there is a possibility that Ricciardo could get a better move for himself if he was able to stick at McLaren for next year. So we'll see whether, they can pay him off. But in regards to Daniel Ricciardo, he just hasn't performed well enough. It is, again, essentially the same as a signing in football where a player, say a striker, you sign that has scored multiple goals for other teams, comes to your team and just doesn't score really that much. As a Chelsea fan, I've had plenty of that in the last 2 or 3 years with Lukaku and Timo Werner, where they've scored plenty of goals at another team and then come to my club and then not really done that much at all. That is essentially what Daniel Ricciardo has done for the McLaren team. He has come to McLaren with a lot expected of him and simply hasn't delivered. Yes, the win at Monza was great, but they were hoping for someone like Carlos Sainz, someone who could consistently finish in the top 5, top 6 of races and be matching Lando Norris, which is not what Daniel Ricciardo has done. He has not been good enough, and McLaren have every right to get rid of him. Let me know, though, guys, in the comments, do you agree or disagree with what I'm saying? Do you think that Ricciardo has been unfairly treated by McLaren? Do you think that Ricciardo The treatment that he is getting is deserved. You know, him being basically sacked off Oscar Piastri, which I think is the right action here. Let me know in the comments section down below. And also let me know, where do you think his F1 career will go after McLaren? Do you think he'll just stay in the midfield now for the rest of his career? Or what do you see happening for Ricciardo? Let me know in the comments section down below. But guys, until my next video has been me, Shazza HD. Goodbye.